Before Edward Cullen brooded in a meadow, before every CW teenager had a tortured, undead love interest, there was a gang of leather-clad bikers terrorizing a California boardwalk to the sound of screeching saxophones. Released in the summer of 1987, The Lost Boys took the vampire and gave it a mullet, a motorcycle, and a killer soundtrack. And in doing so, quietly rewrote the rules for every teen horror movie that came after it. It's stylish, it's ridiculous, it's endlessly quotable, and underneath all that hairspray and fog machine haze, it's hiding a surprising amount of backstage chaos. So dim the lights, lock your bedroom door, and don't invite anyone in, because these are 15 weird facts about The Lost Boys that even longtime fans might not know. Stick around for the very end, because the last one explains why this movie basically invented an entire genre of television. Let's sink our teeth in. It's almost impossible to picture now, but The Lost Boys wasn't always meant to be sexy, dangerous, or remotely grown-up. The project began its life under the working title The Lost Boys, yes, but the tone was closer to a family adventure film than a horror movie. Writers Janice Fisher and James Jeremias originally conceived the story as a spookier cousin of the Goonies, a gang of preteens on bicycles stumbling into a small-town mystery. Except this time the mystery involved vampires instead of pirate treasure. In that early version, the characters who eventually became the fierce, self-styled vampire hunters Edgar and Alan Frog were nothing like the paranoid, comic book-obsessed warriors audiences got to know. They were closer to a pair of overeager scouts, complete with sashes and badges, treating vampire hunting like an extracurricular activity rather than a matter of life and death. Even the vampire gang itself was toned down, written more like a group of mischievous older kids who'd pull pranks on younger campers than a pack of genuinely dangerous predators. Everything shifted when director Joel Schumacher came aboard. Schumacher looked at the family-friendly premise and saw an opportunity to go in a completely different direction. MTV-influenced, moody, and dripping with style. He pushed for older characters, added an unmistakable sexual charge to the vampire gang, and transformed the entire project from a Saturday morning cartoon concept into the leather and neon cult classic that would define a decade of horror comedy. Without that pivot, we might remember The Lost Boys today as a forgotten kids movie rather than one of the most rewatched vampire films ever made. When Corey Feldman and Jamison Newlander were cast as Edgar and Alan Frog, they didn't get a stack of character notes or a session with an acting coach. Instead, Schumacher gave them an assignment that sounds more like a dare than a directorial choice. Go watch as many action movies as possible back-to-back and absorb the swagger. The Frog brothers needed to feel like hardened soldiers, even though their actual battlefield was a comic book shop stacked with back issues. So Feldman and Newlander binged tough guy action cinema of the era, studying the clip delivery, the grim seriousness, and the theatrical machismo of leading men who spent their movies staring down impossible odds. The goal wasn't subtlety. It was to take that entire over-the-top archetype and shrink it down into two teenagers who treat a suburban comic shop like a forward operating base. The result is one of the most delightfully absurd character choices in 80s cinema. Edgar and Alan deliver every single line, even the mundane ones, like they've survived something unspeakable, when in reality their most dangerous prior encounter was probably a customer trying to return a damaged issue without a receipt. That commitment to self-serious comedy is exactly what turned two minor supporting characters into some of the most quotable figures in the entire film. One of the film's most memorable images is the wooden sign welcoming visitors to Santa Carla, followed by graffiti underneath declaring it the murder capital of the world. It's a punchy, dark joke, but it wasn't pulled entirely out of thin air. The Lost Boys was filmed in Santa Cruz, California, a beautiful coastal town with a genuinely unsettling history. During a stretch of the early 1970s, the area was linked to multiple separate serial killers operating in the same general period, an unusual and disturbing convergence that gave the region a grim nickname long before Schumacher ever pointed a camera at its boardwalk. By folding that real history into the fictional town of Santa Carla, the filmmakers gave their vampire story an eerie undercurrent of truth, the sense that even without the supernatural element, this particular stretch of coastline had already seen its share of monsters. Rather than resent the association, Santa Cruz eventually leaned into its cinematic legacy. The historic boardwalk has hosted outdoor screenings of the film as part of its ongoing love affair with its most famous production, letting new generations of fans watch the movie practically within sight of where it was shot. It's a strange, almost affectionate relationship between a town and the horror movie that borrowed its darkest chapter. Jami Gertz's character Star is one of the film's emotional cores, half trapped in David's vampire gang, half desperate to hold onto whatever humanity she has left. But in the earliest drafts of the script, that character didn't exist in anything like her final form. Instead of a mysterious young woman caught between two worlds, the role was written as a teenage boy, used purely as a lure to draw the protagonist Michael into the vampire gang's orbit. When Schumacher took the project in a more romantic MTV-adjacent direction, the character was reimagined as a young woman, opening the door for a doomed romantic subplot between Star and Michael. Even then, the casting wasn't a sure thing. Schumacher reportedly pictured a very different look for the role, closer to a conventional blonde ingenue. It took some persistence from co-star Jason Patric, who had worked with Gertz previously and pushed for her casting, before Schumacher agreed to bring her aboard. It turned out to be the right call. Gertz brought a fragile toughness to Star that elevated her beyond a simple damsel. She reads as genuinely torn, protective of her younger companion, and desperate for an exit that might not exist. Decades later, Gertz has built an entirely different kind of legacy off-screen, having become, along with her husband, part of the ownership group behind an NBA franchise, a long way from riding on the back of a vampire's motorcycle under the boardwalk lights. Casting decisions in Hollywood often come down to razor-thin margins, and the Lost Boys had a few what-if moments that are almost hard to picture in hindsight. Before Kiefer Sutherland locked in the role of David, the ice-cold vampire leader with a piercing stare, another young actor was seriously in the mix for the part, a rising comedic performer who would go on to define an entirely different kind of on-screen persona built around rubbery physical comedy rather than icy menace. It's genuinely difficult to imagine that alternate universe where the vampire leader radiates goofy energy instead of quiet threat. Meanwhile, another future comedy star auditioned for a role among the Frog Brothers, only to lose out to Feldman and Newlander. Years later, at an award show, he jokingly recalled how close the casting had actually come, acknowledging that the final decision came down to a handful of contenders. In hindsight, it's easy to see why Schumacher ultimately steered away from broader comedic talent for these particular roles. The film's tone depends heavily on David radiating genuine danger, and on the Frog Brothers playing their absurdity completely straight-faced. Swap in performers whose instincts lean toward mugging for the camera, and the delicate balance between horror and comedy that makes the Lost Boys work could have collapsed entirely. Getting Jason Patric to play Michael, the film's central protagonist slowly seduced into vampirism, was not a smooth process. When Schumacher first approached him with the role, Patric turned it down. He turned it down again. The concept of playing a fanged, cape-free vampire heartthrob apparently struck him as more embarrassing than exciting. Hardly the kind of role a young actor trying to build a serious career would jump at. Schumacher, however, wasn't willing to let the role go. He met with Patric directly, promising creative input and assuring him the character could be built with genuine depth rather than reduced to a pretty boy stereotype. Eventually, after considerable persistence, Patric agreed to take the part. There's a strange bit of irony buried in that reluctance. Michael's name gets shouted, screamed, and pleaded throughout the film so often that it's become something of a running joke among fans, who've turned rewatches into an informal drinking game around every utterance. The actor who spent months resisting the role ended up hearing his character's name yelled in various states of panic and confusion for nearly the entire runtime. A strange kind of poetic payback for all that early hesitation. At first glance, Edgar and Alan Frog sound like nothing more than a goofy, alliterative gag, brothers, with matching first initials, running a horror-themed comic shop. But the names are actually a deliberate nod to one of the most influential figures in Gothic literature, Edgar Allan Poe, the writer whose morbid poetry and tales of psychological dread helped define horror as a genre generations before vampires ever rode motorcycles. It's a subtle bit of wordplay tucked into a movie otherwise stuffed with neon lighting and rock music, but once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. Two teenage vampire hunters modeling themselves after gritty action heroes, secretly named after a 19th century poet obsessed with death and madness. It's the kind of layered joke that rewards repeat viewings, and it fits perfectly with a film that never took its own mythology too seriously. There's a brief scene where David, badly burned by sunlight, appears to show a flicker of genuine vulnerability, a single tear rolling down his cheek amid the pain. It plays as a quietly effective moment of humanity breaking through his cold exterior. In reality, that tear had nothing to do with acting choices. The vampire's distinctive glowing eyes were achieved using thick prosthetic contact lenses, and those lenses were reportedly so uncomfortable that they caused the actor's eyes to water on their own. When Schumacher saw the resulting tear rolling down Sutherland's face during filming, he recognized how effective it looked on camera and kept the footage in the final cut, turning an unplanned irritation into one of the character's more memorable emotional beats. That wasn't the only physical hurdle Sutherland dealt with during production. He reportedly injured his wrist prior to filming, an injury that had to be concealed for the duration of the shoot, conveniently hidden beneath the same black leather gloves that became a signature part of David's look. The production also had to make accommodations so that Sutherland could still perform the character's motorcycle scenes despite the injury, a testament to the kind of practical problem-solving that defined a lot of 1980s filmmaking, where showing up and working through it was simply part of the job. Joel Schumacher packed The Lost Boys with visual references that blur the line between horror movie and music video, and some of the smallest details reveal just how intentional that aesthetic really was. In one supporting character's bedroom, eagle-eyed viewers can spot a poster referencing another Brat Pack-adjacent teen drama from the era, a wink from Schumacher to his own filmography and the broader teen idol culture of the decade. But the moment most burned into pop culture memory doesn't come from a background prop. It comes from a boardwalk concert scene featuring a shirtless, oiled-up saxophone player delivering an extended solo with an intensity that borders on theatrical. That performer was a real touring musician with genuine professional credentials, having spent years as part of a well-known singer's backing band. Cast almost by circumstance after missing out on another film role, his brief on-screen appearance ended up becoming one of the most enduringly memed moments in the entire movie, a strange piece of immortality built on a 2-minute cameo. It's a perfect example of how The Lost Boys treats its own tone, equal parts genuine style and gleeful self-awareness, never quite sure if it wants to be cool or campy, and ultimately succeeding at being both simultaneously. Long before a certain 2000s vampire franchise made sparkling in sunlight into a punchline, The Lost Boys had already found a way to put glitter directly into its horror. Reports from the production describe practical effects, teams mixing actual glitter into the fake blood used throughout the film, giving the gore an unmistakable shimmer under studio lighting. The effect gave the film's violence a strange glam rock quality, more in line with a concert stage than a traditional slasher movie. That same commitment to memorable, slightly theatrical horror shows up in one of the film's most talked about sequences, a moment where a box of what appears to be plain rice or noodles suddenly seems to writhe with maggots and worms right in front of a horrified character. It's implied to be a form of vampiric mind control rather than literal insects, but long-standing fan rumors have persisted for years that some kind of real, unsettling texture or organic material was used on set to sell the effect more convincingly, kept unsettlingly animated between takes. Whatever the exact truth of the effect, the reaction it produced on camera reads as completely genuine, and the sequence has become a favorite reference point for fans discussing the film's blend of practical effects and dark comedy. It's a kind of scene that makes viewers second-guess their own takeout order for days afterward. Behind the campy fun of the Frog Brothers storyline, the production dealt with a genuinely difficult real-world situation. Corey Feldman, only a teenager at the time, was already struggling with substance issues during filming. At one point, he reportedly showed up to set under the influence and fell asleep during production. Schumacher, known for having zero tolerance for that kind of behavior on his sets, made the decision to fire him immediately. The story didn't end there. Feldman returned the following day, reportedly emotional and apologetic, asking for another chance. Schumacher relented, but only under the condition that Feldman clean up his behavior for the remainder of the shoot. Feldman managed to finish the film, and that second chance became a pivotal moment not just for his career, but for a broader piece of 1980s pop culture. His ongoing on-screen partnership with fellow young actor Haim, which would continue across several more films throughout the decade. That partnership, often referred to collectively by fans, became one of the defining teen duos of the era, even as both actors later faced well-documented struggles with fame and addiction that followed them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Looking back, this film represents an earlier, arguably more innocent chapter of that friendship, captured before the weight of everything that came afterward. Midway through the film, the Frog Brothers hand over a lurid horror comic titled something like Vampires Everywhere, using its exaggerated, pulpy artwork to warn the protagonist about what he's dealing with. The comic looks entirely convincing, the kind of cheap, sensational horror title that might have genuinely existed on a spinner rack in any comic shop of the era. It didn't. The comic was created entirely as a custom prop for the film, designed specifically to look authentic enough to fool audiences. And it worked remarkably well. For years afterward, fans reportedly combed through back-issue bins and asked comic shop owners whether they'd ever come across a copy, convinced that such a memorably strange title had to be real. The actual comic shop location used during filming still exists, and the original prop comic has reportedly been preserved there, occasionally shown to visiting fans who make something of a pilgrimage specifically to see it in person. It's a fitting piece of movie trivia for a film all about things that appear far more real and dangerous than they initially seem. Sharp-eyed viewers have long noticed something unusual about the film's climax. When most of the vampires meet their end, their bodies dissolve in dramatic, effects-heavy fashion. David's, however, does not. His body remains fully intact after his defeat, a detail that stands out precisely because it breaks the pattern set by every other vampire death in the film. That wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate choice meant to leave the door open for a potential sequel, one that would have followed a new, undead gang with a female-led twist, bringing Sutherland's character back into the fold. The idea reportedly had real momentum behind it at one point, along with actor interest in returning. Ultimately, though, it never moved beyond the conceptual stage, falling into the long list of promising 1980s sequel ideas that never secured the studio backing needed to become reality. The concept didn't entirely vanish, however. Later comic book continuations of the Lost Boys story picked up threads related to David's potential return, allowing the character's unfinished narrative to live on in another medium even after the film's sequel idea quietly died. It's a small, deliberate detail hiding in plain sight for anyone who's ever paused to wonder why one vampire's ending looked just a little different from the rest.